Welcome to the Let's Talk Bible podcast, the podcast about anything related to God, religion, and of course, the Bible.
Please remember that this conversation is strictly academic and aims to enrich our knowledge about the people and events in the Bible. However, we also welcome any questions regarding our faith as members of the International Light of the World Church. Hello again and welcome to the Let's Talk Bible podcast. I'm Misael and I'm here with my brother Danny, and we bring to you today an introduction to the Apostle Paul. The series of conversations that we're currently having are all centered around the helpers of the Apostle Paul, the collaborators that he recruited over time during his travels, who helped him establish and confirm some of the members of the early Church of Jesus. And so we just wanted to also touch on who the Apostle Paul was. We think it's important for everybody to kind of get a good idea about his life, about the way that he was with the early church, and simply just a little bit more of background information on the Apostle Paul himself to kind of get a better understanding when we read his letters or when we see him throughout scriptures. We have to remember a lot of the time that he wasn't always this person. He wasn't always this preacher, that in his past life he had a very bad reputation. He started off as a persecutor of the church, but later, when he was called upon by the Lord, he immediately had a very big change of heart, or a very big shift in his life, to where he immediately became very willing to serve the Lord and to follow the will of God. So to start off our conversation, Brother Danny, where are we starting with this introduction to the Apostle Paul?
Hello everybody, and today I would like to start off in Acts 13:9. Just to make a small clarification, this isn't the first mention of, and I'm going to say it in this manner, the Apostle Paul, but it is a verse that will help us clarify his background story of who he was beforehand. Acts 13:9 says like this, quote, "Then Saul, who also was called Paul, filled with the Holy Ghost, set his eyes on him," end quote. Something interesting that I found out upon doing the research, and something I've always had in my mind, I don't know where this idea came from, but I always thought that Saul, his name was changed to Paul.
I think a lot of us grew up with that understanding that his name when he was persecuting was Saul, but then, as we will talk about a little bit later, he has the calling of the Lord, and then he always refers to himself as Paul. So I think that to a lot of us, our first inclination is to think, oh well, the Lord changed his name because he did so with Abraham, where he wasn't Abraham, he was Abram at first, and then the Lord changed his name. He changed Jacob's name to Israel, and so I think that, to me personally, I thought his name was changed from Saul to Paul, but is that it?
Well, yeah. Well, upon doing the research, like it says, there is no recorded biblical text that says that his name was changed or that the Lord changed his name. All we have is this: then Saul, who is also called Paul. And from here on out, in the book of Acts, the writer of the book of Acts doesn't refer to Paul anymore as Saul. From here on out, he refers to him as Paul. So right here's where we can see that transition of the name. According to the research that we were doing, the Apostle Paul, as we'll see a little bit later, was a Roman citizen. And what research tells us is that in those times, it was common for the Romans to have more than one name. Saul being the Jewish name and Paul being the Roman name that he had. So that change of name didn't happen, or his name wasn't changed. It was simply that he had two names, Saul being his Jewish name, Paul being his Roman name.
So Saul after maybe King Saul.
Yeah, because as we'll see,
David.
So as we'll see a little bit later, as a fun fact, the Apostle Paul is from the tribe of Benjamin, which, as we recall, is the same tribe as the King Saul. According to research, what it's telling us that the reason that the Apostle Paul preferred Paul as his name is precisely because he was sent to the Gentile community. Saul being more fitting to be among the Jews, and Paul being more fitting in that Roman environment that he was in. So kind of just to start off with our discussion in this, for us it's an afternoon, but the discussion that we're having at this moment.
You can listen whenever you'd like. Any time of day is
Yeah,
fine.
so we kind of just wanted to make that clarification and that just kind of fun fact, that kind of struck us the first time that we heard it. Saul and Paul are the same person, but there wasn't that name change that sometimes we might have in our mind that his name was changed.
And as you mentioned, I just wanted to maybe make a small clarification. As my brother Danny mentioned right now, the book of Acts was written by someone, not the Apostle Paul, but it was written, as far as we know, from the first verses of the book of Acts. It was written by Luke. And so Luke was somebody who accompanied the Apostle Paul in many of his travels. And so we could think that maybe the distinction is made from when Luke begins to call the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts Paul, from when he would call him Saul, kind of to emphasize to us, the reader, that even though it was the same person, his life had a pretty big change.
And like we said a little bit earlier, Acts 13:9 isn't the first mention, but we wanted to start off right here so that our listeners can know Saul and Paul are the same person, but his name was just never changed. And Brother Misael, do you have the first mention of Saul?
I actually do. So in the book of Acts, chapter 7, verse 57, up until here, it kind of tells us a little bit about some of the early ministers of the Church of the Lord in Jerusalem. In chapter 6, if anybody would like the reference, in chapter 6, it tells us about some men that were anointed to be deacons in the early church. And one of these men was named Stephen. Stephen, not only did he take care of some of the material responsibilities that the apostles had and gave to him, but he also began to preach. And so in his preaching, he kind of upsets the Pharisees of the time, the Jewish community of the time. And so in verse 54 of chapter 7, it begins to tell us the response that the Jewish community had to Stephen's preaching of Jesus. And it says that ultimately they kill him by stoning him. It says in verse 57, quote, "Then they cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, and ran at him with one accord. And they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul." End quote. So this is the first mention of the Apostle Paul. As we said, it may be that Luke was kind of trying to separate in a way to make it a little bit easier to understand for the reader that although Paul and Saul were the same person, this life that Saul had and that the Apostle Paul had was very different, because here we see him at the site witnessing the stoning of Stephen, a man preaching the gospel of Jesus. And then it says in Acts chapter 8 verse 1, quote, "Now Saul was consenting to his death. At that time a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles." End quote. So the Apostle Paul here, still being referred to as Saul, it says that he was consenting in the death of the early Christians, in this particular case, in the death of Stephen, one of the deacons of the early church. So here we see the introduction of Saul. We see the introduction of the Apostle Paul. That even though at one point he was the Apostle Paul preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, he had a very rough beginning, in the sense that he wasn't born into the Church of Jesus, or he wasn't one of the earlier believers of the gospel of Jesus, but he was actually a persecutor of the Church of the Lord. And it also says in Acts chapter 8 verse 3, quote, "As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison." End quote. So this is the very first mention of the Apostle Paul in scriptures.
And not only is this the first mention of him as the persecutor of the church, he also mentions it himself when he writes a letter to the Philippians. And I'm going to read it really quick. Philippians 3:6, quote, "Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless," end quote. So we have that account in the book of Acts where the writer narrates the beginnings of Paul. And then we have the Apostle Paul himself in that letter that he wrote to the Philippians saying in the beginning, well, he was a persecutor of the church.
But let's go even further back than this, Brother Danny. Where is the Apostle Paul from? Where did he grow up? What was his childhood like, if we have any details on that?
Yeah, of course. To start off, we'll see where Saul, or the Apostle Paul, is from. We're reading Acts 22, verse 3. Quote, "I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the Father, and was zealous towards God, as all ye are this day." End quote.
So I want to clarify here a couple of things. What does zealous mean? Because he describes himself in the verse of Philippians and here again as a very zealous man. So zealousy is the ambition, the enthusiasm, the drive that somebody has to certain customs or to certain beliefs. So the Apostle Paul, as he is describing himself in the verses that Brother Danny just read, he describes himself, well, first he tells us where he's from. First of all, he's Jewish, from the tribe of Benjamin. And as Brother Danny said earlier, from the tribe of Benjamin, we also have the very first king of Israel, King Saul, who was also from the tribe of Benjamin. So it kind of might even seem like there was more Sauls from the tribe of Benjamin just because of that ancestral background of King Saul. So anyways, he goes on to say that he was born in the city of Tarsus, which was in the region of Cilicia. And then he also says that he was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel.
So who was Gamaliel?
So Gamaliel is first mentioned in the book of Acts chapter 5. In the book of Acts chapter 5, it tells us about the original apostles having been thrown in jail because they were preaching the gospel of Jesus. And then after they're thrown in jail, the Lord helps them escape, and then they forbid them from preaching. But then immediately after they escape, they find them again preaching the gospel of Jesus. So they bring them in and present them before a council. And this is the book of Acts chapter 5, verse 34. And so within this council, there is a man named Gamaliel. And maybe some of you know the story already, but just so that we don't go in to read it all word by word, just to summarize this. This man named Gamaliel, it says that he was a very prominent man among the Jewish community, very well respected. He was a doctor and teacher of the law of Moses. So he was very highly regarded in the Jewish community, very recognized. And so when this council is kind of rebuking the apostles and telling them that they weren't supposed to be preaching and trying to figure out what they do to them, what to do with them, Gamaliel just tells everybody to kind of calm down, wait a minute. And it says that he has the apostles step out for a little bit, and he begins to talk to the council, and he says, this is Acts chapter 5, verse 38, roughly. He says, if this is of God, there's nothing you can do to stop this. If this is of men, then it's just going to disappear on its own. Don't worry about it. Don't get into any trouble with them, because a lot of the Jewish community already regarded the apostles as messengers of God. Maybe not to the extent to where they
were like prophets.
Right, maybe not to that extent where they recognize the election of God in them or the authority Jesus had given them, but they did have them in high esteem because of the way they preached. And so Gamaliel says, if these men are of men, we've seen other men rise up already and they've gathered people, and then they perish or something happens to them and the people disperse. So leave these men alone as well. If they're of men, then this will disappear. But if they're of God, then there's nothing you can do to stop it anyways. So this man, Gamaliel, as we said, he was a teacher and doctor of the law. So he was very knowledgeable, and I'm sure that within that knowledge that he had within himself, he wasn't about to become a disciple of Jesus or of the apostles, but he didn't react in the same way. He was a lot more calm and kind of just confident that things would work out anyways. So he was to me, very faithful in his own belief. He was very firm in his own belief. And it's kind of interesting to think about that this is the man whom the Apostle Paul says he grew up, or he was brought up at his feet. Because the Apostle Paul was then almost the exact opposite, where Gamaliel was telling these men, slow down, don't watch what you do with these men, with the apostles. And then the Apostle Saul was a persecutor who saw the spread of the gospel of Jesus as a danger to the Jewish belief or to the Jewish way of life, and he wanted to exterminate all believers of Jesus Christ. So this is a little bit of background of how the Apostle Paul was brought up. He was brought up by this very knowledgeable man, but just in the way that he received this teaching and all of this instruction, he ended up with a very different perspective, that he kind of took it upon himself that it was his responsibility to uphold the Jewish customs and the Jewish way of life. And I think that this is a very common theme in just human nature, where Gamaliel was a lot older. So, and he even cites two examples. He says there was this other man who rose up, and there was this other man who rose up, and he gives these examples about things that he had already seen. And the Apostle Paul, he was a lot younger than Gamaliel. Maybe he hadn't seen as much, and he just saw, like I said, that it was his responsibility to defend the Jewish.
A lot more ambitious.
Right, a lot more ambitious. And he describes himself as a very, very zealous man.
Yeah, so we saw right there that Paul was born in the city of Tarsus, which is a region in Cilicia. And like Brother Misael noted, instructed at the feet of Gamaliel. So kind of just to recap, Apostle Paul was born in the city of Tarsus, which is a region in Cilicia, but he grew up in Jerusalem. Something else about his background, according to Acts 22, verse 25 through 29, it says, quote, "And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. Then the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, Yea. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was freeborn. End quote. So, although the Apostle Paul was a Jew, although he grew up in Jerusalem, born in the city of Tarsus, in the verse that we just read, the Apostle Paul is telling us that he was indeed a Roman citizen. And not like the chief captain who said he obtained it, but he says that he was freeborn. In other words, he was born with this freedom that the Romans had. So, born in the city of Tarsus, grew up in Jerusalem, but was indeed a Roman-born citizen.
And this is because?
From the research that we did, so one way was to pay for it like the chief captain, but it is believed, according to the research, that Paul was able to obtain this because of his parents and his grandparents.
Oh, okay.
Seeing as they were Roman citizens. How did they obtain it? I'm not sure about it, but he did come from a generation of Roman citizens.
Okay.
So when he was born in the city of Tarsus, he was a Roman citizen because of his parents or grandparents.
Okay.
And so to kind of just give a little more background about him, we're going to read in Philippians 3:5 through 6. And I know that we're giving a lot of verses here, but towards the end, we'll just do an overview of what we just went over, just so we can have in mind the important stuff about him. So it says in Philippians 3:5, circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. Unquote. So with this one, we obtain a bit more of information. It says from the stock of Israel, as we said earlier, from the tribe of Benjamin. He says a Hebrew, and according to the law, he was a Pharisee.
And blameless.
And blameless. Yeah. And just to get like a little background about the Pharisees, according to what the Apostle Paul says, and I know we're giving a lot of verses, but this is kind of just to prove what we're saying. The Pharisees was a sect from the Jewish community. In the time of the Apostle Paul, there were 3 sects: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Although the Essenes has no biblical background, everywhere we've done our research, the Essenes are mentioned. But the Pharisees, according to Acts 26:5, is one of the strictest of the sects that were in that time. And it says, Acts 26:5 says, quote, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straightest sect of our region, I lived a Pharisee, end quote. So right here is just the Apostle Paul saying, out of all the sects that were right there in that time, the most strictest or the straightest one was indeed the Pharisees. So, and being from the strictest sect from the Jewish community, he describes himself as someone blameless. So it describes the person of the Apostle Paul a little bit more for us.
So I think that's very important to keep in mind, that we would call this today, like out of all of the branches of Christianity, it was the Pharisees were the most conservatives, trying to uphold the most exact way of upholding the traditions that were in the law of Moses, or the teachings from the law of Moses. And so this was the type of person that was Saul of Tarsus. He was somebody who in no way accepted anything else than just the most conservative interpretation of the law of Moses. And then something else about the Apostle Paul was that he also had a trade. It's very interesting, and this is something that I found out recently, that the Apostle Paul's trade was tent making. It says so according to the book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 3. Quote, so because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. End quote. So here it just, this is Luke writing about the Apostle Paul's stay in Corinth, where he meets Priscilla and Aquila. And so he says that they shared their trade. They had the same occupation, which was tent makers. And so the Apostle Paul, he was a Pharisee, and he was
instructed,
very faithful and conservative according to the law of Moses, and he knew how to make tents.
That's interesting because, like, I imagine it nowadays. Someone that's very educated, someone that has, like, the best education they could possibly get, but at the same time being
a plumber.
So before he became this Saul, who was highly regarded among his Jewish community, later on we'll see that he surpassed all of his contemporaries. Before he became this great Saul, before he was a tent maker.
Yeah, he picked up this trade because in one of his letters, and we're not gonna go into it now, but in one of his letters that he writes, he kind of rebukes some of the church members who had stopped working because they were Christians, and he tells them, this isn't what we've taught you. You know that when we were with you, we worked with our own hands. And so this is what the Apostle Paul knew how to do. I guess, he was fully dedicated to the law and to his religious life, I think we could say, but he also knew how to take care of himself. He also was able to work, to make his own living, to be to continue to do this thing, because I think that for a lot of people now, it's kind of the opposite, where people dedicate themselves fully to their work and to their careers, and then leave all of God's things kind of off to the side. But this isn't the way that, that it's meant to be. We're not supposed to push God off to the side to dedicate ourselves to our careers or to our jobs. And we're not saying that that's bad at all. But as the Apostle Paul, his example, that although he was this extremely well-studied man, he also had a trade. He also knew how to work. But anyways, and then a couple more things about him. He spoke Hebrew and Greek, according to Acts chapter 21, verses 37 to 40. And he was unmarried. And this is something that he proudly states. It says so in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7, quote, for I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. I say therefore, to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I, but if they cannot contain, let them marry. End quote. So the Apostle Paul, this is kind of a teaching that he's giving to the church, that those who could stay unmarried, as he was, that they should. Those who can't contain themselves, that they should get married. So, this is just something else about the life of the Apostle Paul. And I think it's very fitting because when we saw that first introduction about him, where he consented in the death of Stephen of the early church, he was traveling around actually persecuting the church, trying to bring them back to Jerusalem to get them also sentenced for receiving the gospel of Jesus. So he was so into that religious lifestyle that I think he just had grown comfortable, and
He didn't have the need.
he didn't feel the
for a
need
spouse.
to get married. But this is something that he describes as his gift from God, to be able to contain himself from marriage and to live that way. But in no way does he enforce this or tell everybody that this is how they should also live.
So we know we gave you guys a lot of verses. We're just going to recap everything without the verses. Starting off where he was born, city of Tarsus, which is a region in Cilicia. He grew up in Jerusalem. He is a Roman-born citizen. Again, Roman-born because he's a descendant from Romans. He is a Jew, Hebrew, and Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin, which, as we said, is the same tribe as King Saul. He was instructed at the feet of Gamaliel, and according to the law, he was a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. His trade was tent making. He spoke Hebrew and Greek and was an unmarried man. So that's kind of what we have, just to kind of give our listeners a background of who the Apostle Paul was as a person before his conversion, and just to kind of wrap it up with our segment on Saul.
Stick around. We're going to be talking also about a little bit about his life as the Apostle Paul, because like we said, the series we're currently discussing is the helpers of the Apostle Paul. And so this was kind of just a little bit of background about his upbringing and his life outside of his missionary trips, which are a big focus of the book of Acts. So yeah, stick around. But so for now, we're going to make a quick pause. We're going to take a quick break to talk a little bit about some current events going on in our very famous segment called Holy News. And again, it's like you're going to say holy cow, but you say news instead. And in this segment, we'd also be very happy to hear from you. If you have any news stories regarding God, religion, the Bible, anything like that, please feel free to send them to us. Our email is letstalkbiblepod@gmail.com, and our Twitter is @talkbiblepod. So we'd be very happy to hear from you. If there's anything you'd like us to discuss.
So today I have an article from the Mercury News. And just so if anybody wants to look it up, the title of our article today is Church Claims Religious Exemption from Local Pot Laws. I'm not going to be reading the whole article, just some bullet points I got from it. This is taking place in San Jose.
From pot laws?
Oh,
is
yeah.
that like regarding marijuana?
Oh, yeah. So just to clarify, these aren't cooking pots. This is indeed marijuana. So a church is claiming exemption, basically saying that they don't have to abide that the laws of what the city or the state has according to marijuana usage, because, and that's what we'll go into. But just to kind of set the tone of where we're at, this is the Coachella Valley Church, which is in San Jose, Northern California, by the San Francisco Bay Area. And just a little background about the Coachella Valley Church. It is the first federally recognized Rastafarian church. Now, we're not going to do a segment about what exactly is the Rastafarian church, but just to kind of give like a small overview about what they believe in. Well, first I'm going to talk about what this church believes in particularly, and then a little bit about what the Rastafarian church is. So, according to the website in the Coachella Valley Church, they are not politically oriented. They sing psalms and hymns, but from what I read and understood, these hymns and these psalms are saying once they offer that burnt offering is not like the people of Israel where they burn the animals. This burnt offering is after they light their joint or whatever it is that they have. So what they mean by burnt offerings is not the animals. They light up, some weed, take a hit, and they sing psalms and hymns.
While
being high, yeah. And we'll go a little bit more about what marijuana is to them. And like we said, I'm not going to do it in depth about Rastafarian. There's more just to give a little background to understand where they're coming from. But it's a Judeo-Christian church. They believe both in Christianity and the Jewish, although they stick a little bit more. They're not extreme fundamentalists, but they do stick a little bit more to what is the Old Testament than what is the New Testament. But like we said, they believe in both. They just stick a little bit more to the Old Testament. The founder is Emperor Haile Selassie, a.k.a. His Imperial Majesty, or HIM, or him. And just to give a little background about Emperor Haile, he was the last emperor, if I'm not mistaken, Emperor 225th of the Ethiopian community. They believe in I and I. Basically what that means is oneness between God and humanity. Their mission is to create a space honoring the spiritual tenets of Christ, an offering of sacramental ceremonies and spiritual healing practices, which include a sermon that is conducted by an oriented minister. They pray, they play music, they meditate, they have guest authors and speakers. And again, this is all from the Coachella Valley Church. This isn't the general Rastafarian. This is kind of specifically towards them. And, they're an open church. Anybody's welcome to join, although they do have some requirements for admission. One of them is that anybody who would like to join the Coachella Church must be 18. They must fill out some paperwork, give a small fee, and just kind of as a waiver for the application that they will be filling out for the medicinal marijuana, because non-medicinal marijuana is not yet allowed. Well, is not allowed in San Jose. So this is kind of, and we'll see a little bit earlier, kind of a way to beat the system. But we'll see, that's kind of like a little background about the Coachella Valley Church. So
quick question.
Yeah.
So do they interpret that when the Bible refers to burnt offering, it means smoking marijuana, or do they just do it that's their interpretation of a burnt offering for today? Or do they read the Bible thinking that a burnt offering, or not thinking, but saying that a burnt offering meant some sort of, maybe if it wasn't marijuana, some sort of substance like that?
From what I've read, they don't. And this has to go back to what they believe that cannabis is.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to read a little excerpt from the Coachella Valley Church. It says, quote, "Cannabis is used with the meditation of a Rastafari. We bless cannabis before smoking it by giving a short prayer, or just being aware about the fact that we are burning something sacred and treat it with respect. It can be used to get a heightened state of awareness where we can feel one with the life force," or Jah, short for Jehovah, but they don't call him Jehovah, they just call him Jah, "or deepened insights about anything we put our focus on," end quote. So to them, cannabis is a sacrament. It is something holy. And when we look into the story that the Mercury wrote about them, in their defense, they say that cannabis is as a holy sacrament to them as wine is for the Catholic Church. So to them, they don't see nothing bad about it. It's something that God made, that God produced for a heightened sense or a more self-awareness for each person. So for them,
Not something controversial.
It's not something controversial. It's something that God made, that he gave to humanity so that they could be one or be closer or have a heightened sense of things.
Okay.
Does that kind of answer your question? So they don't interpret. They know that they sacrificed animals. They know that the people of Israel did all this, but they kind of just have this sacrament that they use nowadays.
I know that you mentioned this is kind of like a case where they're claiming this exemption. Are there any updates on that? How is that going?
So I guess what they're being accused of is being a dispensary of marijuana. In the city of San Jose, or in the state of California, for someone to become a dispensary, they have their regulations, they have their laws that they must abide by. From the 16 marijuana dispensaries that are there, 3 things that the article noted was that those dispensaries, they prohibit on-site consumption. The second one is that whoever is to buy anything must be at least 21. And for them to purchase the medicinal marijuana, they must have a recommendation from a valid doctor. So those are the 3 regulations that are noted in the article. This is what regular marijuana dispensaries must abide by. But as we said a little bit earlier, the church, they allow anyone who is 18. All they have to do is pay a small fee, sign a waiver, and they get it. So they're not getting it by a recommended or a valid doctor. They're just getting this waiver that they're able to consume this medicinal marijuana. And as we said, the dispensaries, they prohibit the consumption on the site. In other words, not only the dispensaries, but from what I read, public consumption is not allowed. It is against the law for public consumption of marijuana. But the church, they have reunions and they have services once a week in which the members or the ones who attend can go, and they could either smoke it inside, smoke it outside, as long as it's within the church property. And what they use to defend themselves is something that is called Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000. So these are the two law articles that they use to justify that they're able to actually consume it within the premises or the property of the church. So
in this podcast, like we said, it's called the Let's Talk Bible podcast, where we're not here to judge what this church is doing, but the Bible doesn't teach us to break the law and then justify ourselves, in this way. So if this is, if the reason that this came up is because this church is being accused, of kind of going around these regulations that have been set up already, then I think that, or at least in my opinion, it's not something that they should continue to do. They should, even if this is what people want to believe, or if this is what people want to do, fine. But I think that the issue comes in where they're going directly against these other laws that have already been set up for these situations.
And something interesting that happened as well is that, they sell marijuana, they sell products, edibles, smoking pipes, all of this, and city officials came to investigate them. And all that they had to comment was that the sale of non-medicinal marijuana is not currently allowed in San Jose. So they investigated them, and basically they had their hands tied because they weren't selling non-medicinal marijuana. They were selling medicinal marijuana. So kind of in a way, they didn't have a way to get them, They didn't have, how to say
how to
stop them. They couldn't say this is unlawful. So all they had to say is non-medicinal marijuana is not allowed. Basically saying they could keep doing it, they found the loophole basically, they're in a church, which is like a church property. They're doing medicinal marijuana. So they kind of did find the loophole so they could continue to sell their marijuana products. And they don't see it as, as a sale or that they're, because the article said that their neighbor church, says it's kind of just, the church is kind of just a front for a marijuana dispensary that doesn't have to abide by the laws.
That's what it kind of sounds like to me.
Yeah.
Honestly. And
they don't say it's a front. They kind of just say, that the members donate the money, when they exchange marijuana for money, it's a donation, So they pretty much have it figured out for themselves. And so that is kind of what just the little news segment that caught my mind, The first federally recognized Rastafarian church is claimed to be basically like a cover-up for a marijuana dispensary, but they kind of have found all the loopholes so they could do it.
That's a strong accusation for a church.
Yeah.
But, and if you have any opinions, listeners, in regards to this first article, please let us know what you think, how you take all this. We'd be very happy to hear from you. But in the next article, it's actually something that's been in the news for a while now. It's kind of just been called now the Christian baker issue. And maybe some of you have heard about this, but it's regarding a Colorado baker named Jack Phillips who refused to bake and decorate a wedding cake for a same-sex couple based on his religious beliefs. So it appears that the main issue is whether the baker has the right to deny this couple the cake they want, and this has been going on for a while now. So why do we bring it up now? Apparently, nearly 1,300 individual religious leaders, and this ranges from Christians to Muslims to Jewish religious leaders, signed briefs and filed them on Monday with the Supreme Court, arguing that religious business owners should be required by law to serve same-sex couples. This is, I know, I kind of, Brother Danny just gave me like a what's going on face, but I kind of was surprised by this as well, because apparently there was other briefs that were filed with the Supreme Court in defense of the baker as well. Some religious leaders are saying, well, he has the right to refuse his services to anybody or to whoever he wants based on his religious beliefs. And now these other religious leaders are saying, no, he should still have to serve or provide his services for anybody. And so if you ask me, what is the real issue here? to me, the real issue is, why are all these religious leaders getting involved in the first place? And the reason I say that is because they're bringing this conflict, this issue, which has happened in the past. So this case is going on in Colorado, but in California, a same-sex couple sued a bakery as well, and they won. And I think they were awarded like $135,000 in damages.
Really?
From the bakery because of the.
Can I ask specifically what the damages were, or what does it mean by that?
Oh, so when they sued, they said that this caused like psychological pain, like, and I read it very briefly, but it was something about they were so hurt and distraught because they were refused the service as a same-sex couple that they gained weight, and that the bakery had to pay them for those damages. Yes, the court
gave it to them
or ruled in their favor. So now that bakery owes them $135,000 for not wanting to make them the cake or bake them the cake. So like I said, this isn't a new issue, but it's getting just so much attention because, this is one man refusing to make the cake for this one couple. But you're bringing in all of these churches, and you're bringing in all of these different people who actually, this man, he doesn't belong to all of these different religious groups, but all of these religious groups are expressing how they think the courts should rule. And that's why I'm saying, I think that the real issue is, why are these churches involving themselves in legal issues? Because it comes down to whether you interpret that having religious beliefs justifies you, because the problem is that on one hand you have religious freedoms where you're free to practice as you believe, and on the other hand you have anti-discrimination laws where you can't discriminate based on certain standards like sex, age, race, things like that. So it comes down to the interpretation of the laws and what has priority. But then on top of that, you have all these people involving churches, where it's no longer this man, it's
a huge organization.
Religion. Yeah, it's a religion, whether the religion is right or wrong. So God's purpose or God's will is not to tell people who to do business with. And lastly here, or at least on my behalf, I just had a verse that I wanted to quote where Jesus says, and this is in John chapter 17, verse 15, quote, "I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from evil," end quote. So to me here, the key word is them. Those who believe in God, those who want to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, then they should do what's right. And again, I go back to the baker. Well, if that's what he believes, then he should do what's right, because instead of trying to impose his beliefs on people who apparently don't share his beliefs, then he should make sure that he does what's right in his own faith. There's just so many things where, if I go to a store, I don't ask what they believe in before I do business with them. I go there because I need something, and whether the cashier or the owner of the business agrees or not with my beliefs, I go back to what Jesus said. We're in this world and we're a part of it, and we just have to learn to deal with these things. But in my own personal life, I'm going to do what I believe God wants me to do. I don't know if any of this makes sense to you, Danny, or what do you think about this?
Well, I was thinking, like, on the baker's defense, was he like in a way like imposing or preaching his belief, or did he kind of just like refuse to make this for them? Like
yeah. Well, as far as we know, he just refused based on the grounds that he believes this is wrong for people of the same sex to get married. And that's what I was saying earlier. If he believes this so strongly, then he should look for a way to make it illegal to get married instead of just saying.
Think so?
I don't know, because I think so in the sense that his not selling them a cake doesn't make what they're doing less immoral in his eyes, or him not selling them a cake is probably not going to stop them from getting married. He's just bringing God, and that's why I said I think that this goes with your story, where we sometimes people can sometimes use God as an excuse,
or like religious freedoms,
exactly, as a front for me to do
Your own agenda.
exactly like this baker. I'm not saying that he doesn't believe these things. He probably does. But how do you fix the issue instead of how can I avoid this uncomfortable situation? And he could, in my opinion, fine, let him lose the business, but do something about it is what I'm saying. I'm saying that maybe not baking this cake is probably not going to stop them from getting married. You're just, in a way, putting God or using God as your reason.
Using God kind of as an excuse to discriminate against them. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the thing about this article, that the issue in a lot of these cases is that they bring a very bad image to religious groups in general. People now very commonly and normally state that, quote, religion is simply a cover for bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination, end quote. This is what people are reporting, not about this man as a baker, but as religion as a whole. Mm-hmm. And that's where I said, why are so many religious leaders involving themselves and weighing in on this that ultimately is not about God, is not about religion. It's about what a man chooses to do with his business. And he can base it on whatever he wants, or he could base himself on anything, but why
use church?
Why use God? Because he's not, as far as I know, he's not stating, his church or anything like that. He's just saying, God doesn't want me to do this. And I think that's where my problem with this comes in, where you can use other reasons. You can say, I choose not to, and, put that blame on yourself instead of making religion as a whole the bad guy.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
What do you think?
I think he's in his right to refuse business to whoever he wants. It's not like, well, from what we know or from what you read, it's not like he was helped by any of these churches to start his business, or he was helped by the government where he can't have these kinds of freedoms since it's his business, But then I get to think, and I don't know if this has anything to do with this, but what if this couple goes to like another baker and that guy refuses? They go to another baker and that guy refuses. Would it be kind of like the same problem, or is that just already a bigger problem already? Because I put myself, like, if I was in that situation, and I go somewhere and they refuse business, and I go somewhere else and I can't get the product that I want, that would suck. Is that the same problem, or is that just something else? So do you think that's like a case that will never happen, or like to say that I will not be able to purchase the item that I want because of my belief or who I am? Like, we go to store to store, you think that's unlikely to happen?
I do think it's very unlikely to happen, just because nowadays there's so many different points of views. There's so many options in the world, and like me, for example, I was looking just recently, like, for a bag to carry my laptop in, and there's some stores that have a style and it's not my style, so I have to keep looking. I can't just go to Walmart because Walmart is closest to me and say, well, I need this, or this is what I'm looking for, so you have to provide it to me because you're a store. And I think it's the same. If this man, he owns a bakery, but he doesn't have to run the bakery the way that I want the bakery to be ran. And I think that in the case that you said, like, if you go to store after store after store, then
it's unlikely.
It's unlikely, but also start the business. Find a solution for yourself instead of forcing your beliefs, because I think it goes both ways. Like, this man is trying to force his belief on them, but they're also trying to force their point of view of what's right and what's wrong on him by making him do what he doesn't want to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I say it's unlikely, because it might not be immediately, but you'll find somebody who will do it. You'll find somebody
who's willing to make
to make your cake. I think it's very different when it's a matter of life and death, where if a doctor is denying you service for your beliefs, then I think that's much different.
Okay.
It's just a very broad,
like, spectrum.
Yeah, it's a very broad spectrum of just all businesses, and I really don't think you can just apply the same rule to everybody. So.
Okay. I think I agree for the most part.
Okay.
This guy, yeah, he could choose what he wants to do with his business,
I think that if there's a baker who, in the future, strictly for same-sex couples, and they want to deny services to all heterosexual couples, that's fine. If that's the business they want to have, then let them have it. So maybe because this is the beginning of it, but do what you want.
It's your business.
But yeah, so those are the new segments we have for you this week. If you have any opinions about any of this, please feel free to contact us. Actually, feel encouraged to contact us. Our email is letstalkbiblepod@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @talkbiblepod, and we'd like to hear your opinion on anything so far. Right, Danny?
Oh yeah, we'd love to.
Add to the conversation or add to the discussion. We're always happy to come back to any of this. So I think that from here we can move on to our second segment of the main topic, which again today we're talking about the Apostle Paul. And earlier we mentioned kind of just a little bit of background about who was the Apostle Paul. We learned that his name wasn't changed to Paul. His name was Saul and Paul.
Still hard to wrap my mind around that.
it's going to take some getting used to, but so his name was Saul, but having the Roman citizenship, he also was named Paul. So for now, instead of just going over more background, I think it'd be a good idea to talk a little bit more about his actual conversion and a little bit of an introduction to his life as the Apostle Paul, who we now know and love. So, Brother Danny, do you have anywhere to start us off from?
Yeah. In the book of Acts, there are 3 recorded accounts of the Apostle Paul's conversion. If I'm not mistaken, one is in Acts 9, the other one is in Acts 22, and the other one is in Acts 26. And these 3 accounts, they have small differences in the way that they're narrated. And that's kind of what we're going to go over. But they all kind of hold the same idea and concept of his conversion. But do you have some of the differences, or?
I do. So before we get into the actual differences, it's important to note that the account in Acts chapter 9 is kind of Luke's version of what happened. We can say maybe he heard this because at the same time, it looks like Luke was in Jerusalem with the other apostles, with the original 12 apostles. So this most likely looks like his testimony.
He wasn't physically there.
That he learned, because he wasn't physically there, because the conversion of the Apostle Paul happened on his way to Damascus. And so from what we know in scriptures, Luke was currently with the 12 apostles in Jerusalem. So he wasn't with Paul, but maybe just from the accounts that he heard, from the things that he knew, this is what he was able to put together. And it's actually the shortest of all the accounts of what happened. And so this is, again, Acts chapter 9. And then in Acts chapter 22, the Apostle Paul has been arrested, and he's telling what happened. So this looks like it's more of something that Luke heard from the Apostle Paul himself during his defense after being arrested. So in Acts chapter 26, this is again the account of the Apostle Paul himself before King Agrippa. And so if you ask me, I would rely more on the later 2 accounts, because the main difference that we find when we read all 3 accounts is that in the first account, Luke writes that those who were with the Apostle Paul didn't see the light, but they heard the voice of the Lord. Mm-hmm. Because as you know, in the Apostle Paul's testimony, he says that on his way to Damascus, because again, he was still persecuting the believers of Jesus Christ, on his way to Damascus, there was a light that was brighter than the sun that blinds him, and he falls onto the ground, and he hears the voice of the Lord saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" So in Acts chapter 9, it says that those who were with Saul at the moment, it says in Acts chapter 9 verse 7, quote, "And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man," end quote. So it says that they were hearing the voice of the Lord as he was talking to Saul. But in Acts chapter 22 verse 9, it says, quote, "And they that were with me saw indeed the light, and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me," end quote. So again, this is this is the biggest difference. The other difference is that in the accounts later on in scripture, the Apostle Paul seems to go into a little bit more detail about what the Lord told him than in Acts chapter 9. But I think that the main difference is that in the first account, they don't see anything, or it says they don't see the man who is speaking, but they hear the voice. And in the other accounts, they don't hear the voice, but they also saw the light. So I would trust the second accounts a little bit more, since this was the Apostle Paul speaking what had happened. And I think that it's very possible that back then, due to the difficulty of these writings, because as we know, the book of Acts spans many, many years, at least 30 years, so in order to keep it as close to what happened, I'm sure Luke had to write this while all these things were happening. So I would consider the Acts chapter 22 and 26 the more truthful versions, because this is the Apostle Paul in his later years speaking himself about what had happened. So the message is pretty much the same. The Lord calls Saul, and he says in Acts chapter 26 verse 16, quote, "But rise and stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness, both of these things which thou hast seen, and of those things in the which I will appear unto thee." End quote. So here we see the mission with which the Lord comes to Saul. He comes and he says that he was going to make him a minister and a witness. And I think that this brings us to our next point on one of the other reasons why we're talking about the Apostle Paul. Because as we will probably get to in the future, when we talk about one of his helpers, who was Barnabas, some people consider him also an apostle. But if you ask us, Barnabas and the Apostle Paul, they didn't have the same place or the same title even within the church. But the Apostle Paul had what the other apostles had, because Paul never lived with Jesus. He never walked with Jesus or heard Jesus speak before Jesus was crucified. But in his calling, it's Jesus who speaks to him, or it's the Lord who speaks to him, and he says to make thee a minister and a witness. So after the calling of the Apostle Paul, he immediately begins to preach.
And in that same chapter where you're reading in Acts 26, just in verse 19, where he's still kind of testifying to the King Agrippa, he says, quote, "Whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision, but showed first unto them of Damascus, and at Jerusalem, and throughout all the coasts of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, and do works meet for repentance." End quote. So, as you said, right after his calling, he went out and he started to preach, firstly to Damascus and to Jerusalem and all the coasts of Judea.
And so what was the Apostle Paul preaching? In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, the Apostle Paul writes, quote, "For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it, and said, Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me." End quote. So we'll stop right there, but the point of this is that the Apostle Paul speaks as one of the apostles who was actually there, because he not only describes like a teaching of Jesus or an event that happened, but he talks as if he had been there. And the definition of witness is somebody who saw an event take place. So when Jesus tells him, "I have chosen thee to be a minister and a witness," it's not, from what we're reading, it's not in a figurative way. He literally begins to reveal to him, these things that had happened, because as you might know, there wasn't cameras back there. There wasn't anybody recording any of these things happening. But the Apostle Paul, many years later, he's recalling these events, and in his teaching, he speaks as somebody who actually witnessed these things.
I think that's something important to keep in mind, because doing the research, we see a lot of preachers or many folks comment saying that revelation or that moment where Jesus manifested himself to him was the only time that he revealed himself to him. But according to the three accounts, Jesus never revealed to him what had happened that night.
Right.
If we stick strictly to what the accounts say. So what is it that I'm trying to get at is that he must have revealed himself more times for him to speak in this manner, as if he witnessed what happened. Jesus had to have revealed to him what actually happened,
right,
on more than one occasion.
Oh, of course. And I mean, I think that that's closing the door on something that not even the Bible closes the door on, just because in Acts chapter 26 verse 16, which we already read, where it says, quote, "But rise and stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness both of these things which thou hast seen, and of those things in the which I will appear unto thee. End quote. So, the Lord doesn't say up until now, or this revelation, this is it. He apparently leaves, that
door open.
That door open, saying those things in the which I will, future tense, appear unto thee. So I've also heard that a lot of people think that the Apostle Paul had to answer to the original 12 apostles in Jerusalem. But again, we're going off of Scripture. And in Scripture, the Apostle Paul doesn't credit the other apostles for the things he preached or for the doctrine he had. He always gives credit to Jesus himself. And if we jump to Galatians chapter 1, verse 15 and 16. So in these verses, there's a few commas in there. So I'll read over the verses. I'll read them over once and then I'll read them again without reading the commas, because they kind of just expand on what he's already saying. So he says, Galatians chapter 1, verse 15, quote, "But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus." End quote. So I'll read the verses again without the comma portions, because I feel at times we could
get thrown off.
Yeah, it kind of confuses us a little bit. So it says, again, starting from Galatians 1:15, "But when it pleased God to reveal his Son in me, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus." So see, even in this, which is believed to be one of the first letters that the Apostle Paul writes in his life as an apostle to the Galatians, he doesn't credit having received any of his teachings from the other apostles or from the original apostles in Jerusalem. He credits only God, who revealed to him this ministry, this that he was preaching, because the letter of Galatians in verse 6, he goes on to describe that there's only one gospel. The gospel they had already received from him was the one gospel. And again, he didn't learn this from the other apostles who were eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus. He received this through the revelation of Jesus, beginning on the road to Damascus, but throughout his life as well, from what we understand, since not everything is written in those initial accounts of what happened.
So this is why we found it important to cover the Apostle Paul before his conversion, and a little bit after his conversion. Because our segment that we're going to be doing is the Apostle Paul and his helpers. So covering the Apostle Paul's testimony, we saw very important details in which sets him apart from his helpers. Seeing as the Apostle Paul, although he didn't know Jesus Christ in person, he definitely did not follow him before his conversion. There definitely came that moment when Jesus Christ manifested or revealed himself to him, in which Jesus Christ gave him a ministry, gave him the doctrine that he was to preach, showed him the gospel, revealed to him, like the example that we saw, what had happened the night that he was betrayed. Although he wasn't there, he knew what happened as if he saw it, because he saw it. And this was what sets him aside from his helpers. His helpers, they might have known the doctrine, they might have been great preachers, they might have been very fluent in the way that they spoke, but they learned it from the apostles. As we covered in the example of Apollos, he was preaching, Aquila and Priscilla heard him preaching, but they set him aside to show him the way of the Lord more perfectly. How did they know that he needed a little bit more in his preaching? Well, because of the preachings that they heard from the Apostle Paul. In other words, all of this is coming from a source, the apostles. But when it comes to the Apostle Paul, his source is directly Jesus Christ. It's what sets him apart from his helpers. So this is why we found it important or necessary to cover the testimony of the Apostle Paul, just to kind of explain what the difference is between him and his helpers. Although, yes, they were great preachers, they had received it from the apostles, and the Apostle Paul received it directly from Jesus Christ. So in our following podcast, we're going to continue doing the helpers of the Apostle Paul, but in our next ones, we'd like to cover the missionary trips that the Apostle Paul did. One of the reasons is that our timeline is heavily based on his missionary trips. That's kind of like our standard timeline that we have. So just to kind of know what he did, when he did it, who did he take, just to kind of set the setting that we're in. So in our next podcast, we won't be doing a specific helper. We'll be doing more of the missionary trips of the Apostle Paul.
Right, so kind of like his life after this conversion, after he started going by Paul. So we just thought that it'd be a good foundation to have just about his life in general and a little bit of his background and also his approach to his preaching. Because throughout his letters and throughout his travels, we see the character of the Apostle Paul come through a lot of the time in the way he expresses himself. And just as he was a very zealous man with the Jewish customs and traditions, he continued to be a very zealous man in the way of God, but no longer to uphold the law of Moses, but now to uphold the doctrine that Jesus Christ revealed to him. So he was traveling before persecuting the church, and now he was still traveling, but now he was establishing the church and
spreading the gospel.
And spreading the gospel throughout all of these regions. So this is the character of the Apostle Paul, this man who was very well educated, and I know we didn't touch on it very much this time, but we will in the future. He was the one who defended himself in the times that he was arrested, precisely because he knew his rights. He knew as a Roman citizen what he was entitled to. And yeah, we'll continue to talk a little bit more next time about the Apostle Paul, a little bit more focused on his travels and what he actually went through while spreading the gospel and while preaching and while visiting the different churches in what historically is known as the Apostle Paul's missionary trips. So if there's anything that we missed, we'd be very happy to hear from you. Please stay till the end for some of our contact information, and we hope that you can tune in next time. This is the Let's Talk Bible podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Stay up to date. Remember to follow us on Twitter at TalkBiblePod. Or to join the conversation, you can email us at letstalkbiblepod@gmail.com.
Please remember that this conversation is strictly academic and aims to enrich our knowledge about the people and events in the Bible. However, we also welcome any questions regarding our faith as members of the International Light of the World Church.